Morning, everyone. This is Jason Tondro, your professor for World Lit, and we're here to talk about, I think this is our 9th lecture. We're wrapping up our review of the medieval period, which in our class is, broadly speaking, everything from about 700 AD, we started with Beowulf, all the way through the early 1400s. There's 2 texts that we're going to talk about today. The first of them is Marie de France's Lays, especially Lanval. And the second is the much longer text, Sir Gawaine and the Green Knight. Let's start with Marie de France first. There is a great tragedy of our class. Part of it's because of the length of the class. Part of it's because of the survey nature of the class, because we're talking about so much in terms of time period, and because I've chosen to pick texts that were influential in the creation of other texts. In other words, we read the Bible and the Iliad and the Aeneid, and then we read books that talked about the Bible and the Iliad and the Aeneid, and so that Aeneas and Odysseus show up in the Inferno and so on. And I've been trying to build over the course of this class an appreciation for literature in the sense that how each piece of literature feeds into another piece of literature, that they're connected and there's influences here. And my hope is that when you get to reading whatever you like to read, whether it's Harry Potter or Hunger Games or Twilight or whatever your favorite series of novels might be, or you'll come to understand that the people who wrote those books read books, right? And the people who are going to write the next set of books read these books. And Tolkien has a metaphor for literature. Of course, anyone who's read Tolkien will be not at all surprised to understand that his primary metaphor is a tree. And when he wrote an essay about literature, about writing, he called it Tree and Leaf, because he understood this idea that literature is like one trunk and everybody sort of branches off of it, but a lot of branches feed off of previous branches. And where in that tree is Virgil or Dante or Beowulf? There's a great tragedy in this class, and that is that while we spend a lot of time talking about women as characters in this class, we talk about Dido, we talk about the wife of Bath, and so on, we will spend very, very little time talking about women as authors. And that is a shame, because the women's literature of this time period is amazing. It is fantastic. It is great to read. It's wonderful stuff. But, as the wife of Bath noted in her own prologue, men wrote all the books in terms of fame and influence. All the books that people knew about during this time. I shouldn't say all. A great many of them were written by men. And when we examine this idea of books as influencing other books, what we really end up reading is essentially men influencing other men. This does a great injustice to people like Christine de Pizan, whose wonderful book of The City of Ladies, or Marjorie Kemp, who wrote this. Well, she couldn't write, so she got her priest to dictate her life story, and she talks. She was just an ordinary middle class tradeswoman, but she walked on foot all the way to Jerusalem, and she tells her story about it. Marjorie Kemp's story, or well, there's a million other things that we could be going to. In the Renaissance, we could be talking about some of, for example, the Queen Elizabeth herself wrote poetry, wrote speeches, wrote letters. We could be reading those. We could be reading some of the writing by the various women in her court, and so on. If we go farther back, there's classical and medieval literature written by women, but not enough of those got into our syllabus this semester. This week is our rare exception to that rule, and we're going to start off talking about Marie de France. We don't know a lot about Marie. She might have been a nun. She might have been trained in a religious school somehow. But that's a guess, only because we don't know a lot about her, how she got her education. She says that she's from France, but she writes in English, in the English that was spoken after the French invaded in the Norman Conquest. She writes her poetry and her stories to the king, which suggests that she might have had some royal connections. But the truth is that the only things that we know about her are what she tells us in her own poetry. And this is an example of exactly what the wife of Bath is talking about, that, the men are, for a lot of this time, were sort of the keepers of the keys, and so they were the ones that got all the books written, and they were the ones and they wrote them, and they wrote about the things that mattered to them. We talked about Beowulf, for example, as a book by men, by manly men, sort of for manly men, and where are the women's voices? So let's look at Marie de France and ask, this is really dangerous to do because we've only got one example here, but is there anything that we can look at here that shows a difference, that shows something distinctive or particular to the women's voice, in contrast to literally everything else we're going to read this semester? Our Marie de France section starts on about 294. Marie de France, her literature is what we call the Breton lay. Breton, Breton, not to be confused with Britain. The Breton lays come from the land of the Breton culture, the Breton language, which is on the very north coast of France, right near England. If you remember your geography at all, right? You've got, see if I can do this. You'd have, England up here or so, and then down south is France, right across the English Channel. I'm trying to write on the invisible wall here. I should get a weather map. Anyway, people from England and France often, they sort of colonized each other. There was a kind of circular movement here. So the French settled into England, and then the English would go all the way to Cornwall, which is the edge, the far western edge of England, and then they would sail back to France, and you had this kind of circular motion going on there. And a lot of the culture crossed over and intermingled, so that stories would be preserved both in French and in English, maybe with little regional differences and regional variations. And all of that is what we think of as Breton. And the territory here is Brittany, which is the northwest coast of France across the Channel from England. And that's where these lays come from. That's where these stories come from. Looking at the very beginning of Marie's lays on 295, she immediately talks about what she claims is her reason for doing this. Whoever has received knowledge and eloquence in speech from God should not be silent or secretive, but demonstrate it willingly. When a good deed is widely heard of, then, and only then, does it bloom. And when that good is praised by many, it has spread its blossoms. This idea that good deeds should be made public. And it's only when you spread the news of that good deed that other people get inspired by it to do the same thing. Beowulf would entirely agree, right? This idea that good acts are known by you and God, and that's all that matters. That's not Marie de France's argument in this. She specifically wants to be remembered. She says, I'm writing down my name and where I come from in order to be remembered for posterity, for the sake of future history. The custom among the ancients, as Priscian testifies, was to speak quite obscurely in the books they wrote. That is, we used difficult language, and we used a lot of metaphor and allegory, so that those who were to come after and study them might gloss the letter. In other words, you read the words and supply its significance from their own wisdom. You read the words, but the words are hard to understand, and you end up supplying their meaning yourself. This is that controversy that we've talked about before, which is, should poetry be easy or hard? Should poetry be simple and straightforward, using simple language and easy that anybody can get? Or should it be difficult? Should it be elusive? Should the words and the vocabulary and the poetry itself be constructed in such a way that it's just hard to read? It takes a long time. It makes you slow down and think about it. You might even have to learn another language to read poetry. Marie is sort of siding with the hard poetry side of the debate. She says, when you make your poetry hard, it engages the reader. It makes the reader have to put more of himself into it in order to get anything out of it. And that creates a connection, makes the literature work. Let's get to the story. The story of Lanval is an Arthurian story of romance. Now, this is an important idea here, okay? When we talk about a romance, that word has a very specific meaning that's not what normally people think of when you think of a romance. If I talked about a romance, most of you would think, oh, that means it's a love story. And all romances are love stories. And we think of things like romantic comedies and so on. In terms of medieval, Renaissance literature, and even the classic literature, that's not what a romance means. Romance, rather, can be distinguished by a number of characteristics. It's a genre. It's a genre of writing, the romance. And it has a number of characteristics. It's often particularly about knights or adventurous, knights and their adventures. Now, not always. And what does that word knight mean? The knight was a medieval creation. And the sense of romance, in the terms of the people that were writing it and called their own literature, this is a romance, like Marie, that in that sense, the word is essentially comes from the medieval. That's when it's first used in this way. So the earliest romances in that sense, in the literal, we're calling this a romance. I'm putting out this book, I'm calling it a romance. That stuff dates to the medieval period, the Middle Ages. And Arthurian literature is a romance, and the Song of Roland is a romance, and the story that the wife of Bath told about a knight who goes out looking for what women want, that's a romance. There doesn't have to be a love story in it for it to be a romance. It's about knightly adventure. Okay. It's magical. The romance is an imaginative genre. It has magic and wonder, and it's about enchantment. And things happen in a romance that don't make logical or rational or realistic sense. It's not about that. And in many ways, this is actually a better way to understand the romance. Not as a story about knights in the medieval period, although many of them are, but rather a sense of romance as imaginative literature, fantastic literature, as opposed to non-fantastic literature. And writers have understood this over the centuries. So, for example, in the 18 and 1900s, when people like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne started to write science fiction, it wasn't called science fiction. It was called a scientific romance. Okay? There's no knights in it. There were no knights in these. They were stories about going to the moon, or what if a guy could go invisible, or whatever. But these, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, right? Let's build a submarine and explore the underwater world. They were called romances because they were imaginative. They were fantastic. That is the heart of the romance. Now, when we talk about knights, what that does mean is that the protagonists of the romance tend to be sort of aristocratic and usually white male, traditionally sort of white male power figures in their society. You don't write a romance about an ordinary guy unless you're trying to play with the genre. You're trying to satirize it or you're trying to modernize it. You write romance. Romances are traditionally about the upper crust of society. And if you take that notion of a romance, that it's imaginative, it's about fantastic things happening to these leaders of society, well, isn't the Iliad a romance? See what I'm getting at? That we think of romances as about knights, but really the basic idea that it's an imaginative story, possibly designed to teach something, and in which the protagonists tend to be aristocrats or the rulers of their society. That opens up the romance field to be a very large and very rich body of literature. Well, Lanval is firmly in that genre. Lanval is a knight. He's a king of his own land, although we don't know where. It doesn't come up. And he's in the court of King Arthur. But it's a different kind of romance, though, because, as you'll read, Lanval, we had this idea of the sort of classic knight's tale. What is the classic story of a knight? Well, it's like rescuing the damsel in distress, right? Some princess gets captured and the knight has to go rescue her. And this trope has become so cliched that movies come out whose sole purpose is to make fun of that notion. And we get movies like Shrek and Tangled and Brave, right? Which are all about guys who end up being saved by the women, right? Lanval is that. Those movies, those stories about the women who show up and save the guy, their roots are in stories like Lanval. Lanval is a knight, and he gets. If you look at the pages, I'm on 297. He's in the court of King Arthur, and Arthur distributed wives and lands to all but one who had served him. That was Lanval. Arthur forgot him. Okay, what do? Well, first thing we notice is this idea that, Arthur's like the ring giver, right? He's Hrothgar from Beowulf. He's the guy who sits back and gives out wealth and riches, which helps build loyalty to the king and ensure stability in the kingdom, right? This is, pre-capitalism. Okay. Second thing, he's giving out wives and lands. Sometimes in feminist literature and we'll talk about this notion of women as currency, as a means of exchange. And we are total. There's no bones made about that here. Marie says, look, these women were used as bribes. They were gifts. And they were given out to these men so that those men would stay loyal to the king. We'll make you rich with land. We'll give you a wife, and she probably is bringing money with her too. And this will help build your loyalty to the king. But Lanval is forgotten. He's like the one that no one remembers. So he doesn't get a wife and he doesn't get lands. And this reminds us of somebody else, right? Reminds us of Achilles. What is Lanval's reaction? Well, he refuses to let this insult show, and he continues to live. Normally, he doesn't complain or whine. He doesn't go to Arthur and say, "Hey, you forgot me." He doesn't do any of that stuff because that would be dishonorable to him. So he just continues to go on as if nothing has ever happened. My lords, don't be surprised. A strange man without friends is very sad in another land when he doesn't know where to look for help. Lanval was in difficulty, depressed, and very worried. We've talked in previous classes about this idea of hospitality, that, the world is a dangerous place. And when you have a home and you have a little bit of food and a little bit of money, you are morally obligated to offer that to people who come to you, because, we all have to stick together. Lanval's in another country. He's not native to England. He's got no friends. He doesn't. Everyone sort of looks down on him, or maybe we get this hint elsewhere in the poem that maybe they're a little jealous of him. That Lanval's because he is the outsider, he's seen as kind of an intruder. Like, well, we're doing just fine here on our own. We don't really need any sons of foreign kings coming in here and rocking the boat. So maybe Arthur forgets about him, but maybe everybody else sort of exiles him on purpose. Well, Lanval is out in the wilderness when his dilemma is solved, when a mysterious woman appears out of nowhere, and she's not only fabulously beautiful, she's fabulously rich, and she's served by beautiful handmaidens, and Marie goes on at great length to describe how this woman is dressed and how, not only how beautiful, but specifically sort of how sexy she is. And she says, Lanval, I've been keeping my eye on you, and I have been interested in you for a long time, and now I would like to be with you, for not just now, but for the rest of our lives. There's a catch, right? What we're seeing here is a kind of fairy, magical sort of bargain going on here. The deal is this: I will be your ideal woman, but you can never tell anybody about me. Which reminds us of something else, right? The wife of Bath story. Remember, the wife of Bath, the knight is offered a deal. I can be beautiful, but I'll sleep around on you. Or I can be the perfect woman, the perfect wife, but I'll be old and ugly, right? And this comes down to a question of public reputation versus private reputation. The hot wife means that everybody in the world will admire the husband because of his beautiful wife, right? Any guy who could get that woman, he's great. He's very masculine. But the opposite is the private. She'll be everything he needs her to be, but he won't get the public acclaim. This is the same deal. It's just described a little differently. The intricacies are a little bit different. But it's basically the same deal. Do you want to be famous, or do you want to be happy? That's an interesting choice, isn't it? Famous or happy? So people say, well, to be famous would make me happy. In this case, the wife says, if anyone, I will only be with you as long as you keep me a secret. Okay. Well, Lanval says, sure, yeah, I can do that. And now, not only are his loneliness issues solved, but his poverty issue is also solved. You get the sense that Marie here is writing for people who had very realistic financial concerns. If you're talking to an audience who cares about money, then your story has a guy who cares about money. But she's also sort of leavening all of that with the woman's voice at the same time, right? And notice the position of authority, the woman, and Lanval's fairy bride is never named. His mysterious wife, she's never named. She comes in and she says, "Look, here's the deal. Take it or leave it." And he says, "I take it." He says, "Okay." All right, so Lanval's newfound success, he returns back to Arthur's court, and now he's wealthy, and she actually casts like a spell on him. So the more money he spends, the more money he gets. So he's never short of wealth anymore. And he starts hosting all of his friends, and everyone notes how wealthy he is, and this starts to reflect in his fame, and he starts to get famous, but not for his beautiful wife. He gets famous for his fabulous wealth, and this makes him elevated in the eyes of others at court, and he attracts the attention of the queen. Now, when we talk about Guinevere is kind of a famous adulterer, but most stories of Guinevere don't portray that adultery as a bad thing. She's seen as still a protagonist, a sympathetic protagonist, despite the fact that she has an affair with Lancelot, mostly because in these stories it's portrayed that Lancelot is sort of the person she's really in love with, and her marriage to Arthur is just kind of this, thing that she had to do, maybe for political reasons or whatever. Well, that part of the story we're not getting into here, and we're not going to read any of the Mallory or any of the core Arthurian stories. We're going to read another one later on today. But Guinevere was famous as an adulteress at the various early stages of the Arthurian literature. I mean, if you go back and you look at Welsh oral poetry in the 500s, 600s, before any of this Arthur stuff was written down, they're talking about Arthur's queen Guinevere and how she slept around. This is one of the oldest elements of the legend, which is really odd when you think about it. That's the one thing that Guinevere should be known for, is that she slept around. Well, anyway. So here, it's not Lancelot who draws the queen's eye, it's Lanval. Not before, not when he was poor, but only now that he's rich and everybody is talking about him. So there's not only the fact that he's wealthy, but it's the fact that he is admired by others. That makes him more attractive. He's famous. And Guinevere is drawn to this, and she propositions Lanval. She says, "I've had my eye on you for a long time. Why don't we go off and have some private time?" And Lanval is in a difficult spot here. He's being propositioned by a woman of superior social status. And we talk a little bit, you've probably heard about this idea of courtly love. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but this idea that, the knight and the woman he loves has a kind of ideal love relationship, and we call that courtly love. Well, there's a lot of debate, even now, hundreds of years after the fact, of whether or not courtly love ever actually existed, or it was only something that people wrote about in poetry. But when we have these stories of courtly love, this is actually the usual relationship, is a knight to the wife of a superior. To Guinevere, Lancelot to Guinevere, for example, where Guinevere is the wife of the king. In this case, Lanval to Guinevere. It's the knight is the lower social status, and the woman is the higher social status, but she is married to the knight's immediate superior. Now, there's a couple of ways to look at this courtly love issue. One of them is the cynical way. The cynical way to talk about it is that courtly love was this woman as currency idea, that the king, the lord, would use his wife as a kind of money to buy the loyalty of the knight. So here, I'm going to give you this thing, in this case, the thing being his wife. I'm going to give you this thing, and you can do whatever you want with it, and in return, you will be loyal to me. The non-cynical way is to talk about the way that this relationship empowers the woman in the relationship, because she becomes the one who calls the shots. She's the one that says when we're going to kiss. She's the one that says when we're going to sleep together. She's the one that says, well, if you want to hold my hand or you want to walk with me in the garden, first you have to do all this ridiculous stuff to prove that you love me. And if you've seen The Knight's Tale, that wonderful Heath Ledger film, in which he falls in love with this woman of the court, and she tells him, well, all right, if you really love me, prove to me that you love me. I want you to lose. I want you to go to the tournament and lose. Just stand there and let people beat on you all day long. And he says, oh, all right. And so he lets himself get beat until finally she says, oh, he really does love me. Okay, now you can win. All right, so then he goes back and wins. This is the classic courtly love sort of story. Well, anyway, you can talk about that as a situation in which women are empowered, or you can talk about a situation in which women are demeaned. And that controversy is going on to this day. You put half a dozen medievalists in the room and we will argue for 6 hours, okay? So, Lanval is in a difficult spot because Guinevere is superior to him. And how do you say no to a woman who's superior to you? You have a very difficult sort of fine line to walk. And he finagles that line, but he's not very good at this. He's never had to deal with this before. This is in contrast to Gawaine, who we'll get to later. And instead, he kind of loses his temper, and he gets rash, and he says, look, I'm not going to go sleep with you. You know why? Because I already have a woman whose maids are prettier than you. He says, not only is she the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, but she's served by servants who are prettier than you. And Guinevere runs off crying, and she goes right to Arthur. And of course she makes up a story that makes herself look good. She says, Lanval tried to come on to me. He made a pass at me, and when I told him no, he said, oh, well, you're an ugly old hag, and I'm married to this woman whose maids are prettier than you. Okay. So Arthur, think about this question. How is Arthur portrayed in this poem? What is Arthur like as a guy? And how does he rule? Well, he buys into this story from Guinevere immediately. But he doesn't just make a decision. He calls his barons together, and they all have a debate over what to do about this insult to the queen. This is a French version of Arthur. In England, Arthur was traditionally portrayed as a kind of one man, one voice, what I say goes, kind of very powerful ruler where, he made the decisions, he called the shots. This reflects British concepts of kingship, where the king was essentially an absolute ruler. He was very powerful. Compared to France, French versions of kingship were very different. In France, the king was comparatively weak, and he couldn't do anything. There wasn't much he could do by himself. He needed to have a lot of other nobles, like the barons, behind him. And if all the nobles supported him, that's how much he could do. If he wanted to go to war, the barons had to want to go to war. If they didn't want to go to war, there was no war. Okay? If he wanted to make changes, and the barons could limit his power, because all the land was owned by the barons. The king had a comparatively small domain. It was right around Paris. This is different than England, where in England, all the land was basically owned by the king, and he kind of gave it out to other people, but it all eventually went back to him. France was not like this. So when France writes about King Arthur, Arthur's this kind of patsy who has a bunch of other knights around him, and he can't really do anything by himself. He just sends his knights off to do it. French versions of knighthood versus English versions of knighthood. Well, Marie de France is from France, and although she's writing for a powerful king, the story she's telling comes from France. And in it, Arthur calls the barons together, and he has a committee meeting, and they decide, what are we going to do about this insult to my wife? And they all agree, well, Lanval's got to go on trial. And they put Lanval on trial for insulting the queen. And you get the sense from these pages that they're getting a bit of a grudge out on Lanval, because here was this guy, he was an outsider, he was a stranger in our country, and he was a nobody, and we kind of exiled him socially, but then he suddenly got rich and famous, and he started to detract from our fame, our portions of the pie, so now we're gonna stick it to him. by putting him on this trial. So how does this end? Now Lanval is depressed and sad because he knows he broke the deal with his mysterious lover, and so he's actually given up. He's like sitting there in prison. He gives himself up. He gets and he doesn't make any great effort to do anything. He knows he's broken the deal, and he's resigned to his fate. When suddenly these two beautiful women come into the city, and everyone's like, oh wow, no one knows who they are. That must be Lanval's girlfriend. Hey Lanval, is one of those your girlfriend? And he says, no, I don't know who those people are. I've never seen them before in my life. This is a test, because it happens again and again. This is Lanval being tested, in some sense by the author, in some sense by his love. Because Lanval could have said yes. He could have said, yes, that's my girlfriend, and then he would have been off the hook. Right? And they would have said, oh, okay, your story was true. You can go free. He knows he's done wrong, so now he has to prove that he appreciates his love, his woman, and the deal. He says, no, I don't know who those women are. And they show up, and they say, everybody make way for Our Lady who's coming. And they set up this pavilion and visit Arthur's men and so on. And a little bit later, another pair of women come, even more beautiful than the first two. And the barons once again say, Lanval, is this your girlfriend? And he says, I've never seen those women before in my life. The test again, right? Again, another opportunity for Lanval to have said, yes, that's my girlfriend, let me go. And the women say, we're here to prepare for the coming of our mistress, so make way. Finally, after Lanval has already proven his loyalty, his fidelity, and his humility, he's been willing to suffer in prison for his love, she shows up. And everybody acknowledges that she's the most beautiful woman in the world and that her maids are prettier than the queen. And Lanval's telling the truth, and so he's released from prison. Now, why is this story interesting? What makes it worth reading? Well, it's a complete reversal of the traditional damsel in distress story, isn't it? The knight is helpless. He doesn't do any physical activity. He's only captured and put in prison, and he's rescued, not by the knight, but by her, right? She does the rescuing, not with physical power. That's not her power. Her power is social power. The lady entered the palace. I'm on page 309. The lady entered the palace. No one so beautiful had ever been there. She dismounted before the king so that she was well seen by all. And she let her cloak fall so they could see her better. This is her power. Men, they get what they want through physical force. They beat on people with swords. Women get what they want in this culture, right? Through being seen and using that. She shows up. She's not just beautiful. She lowers her cloak and lets everybody observe her. And in that observing, she gains authority over them. I have loved one of your vassals. You see him before you, Lanval. He has been accused in your court. I don't want him to suffer for what he said. You should know that the queen was in the wrong. He never made advances to her. Now how does she know this? And for the boast that he made, if he can be acquitted through me, Let him be set free by your barons. Whatever the barons judged by law, the king promised would prevail. This is the Arthur that we see in French literature. An Arthur who is essentially just there to implement the will of the barons. To the last man they agreed that Lanval had successfully answered the charge. He was set free by their decision and the girl departed. The king could not detain her, though there were enough people to serve her. Outside the hall stood a great stone of dark marble where heavy men mounted when they left the king's court. Wearing your armor, it was pretty hard to get onto a horse. So you would have there's this platform of stone, and you get up on the stone and you climb down onto your horse that way. Lanval climbed on it. When the girl came through the gate, Lanval leapt in one bound onto the palfrey behind her. He's not even leading the horse. Sovereignty. Think back to the wife of Bath, right? What is it that women want? Women want to be in charge. And Lanval gets it. And he's happy for the rest of his life because he let the woman call the shots. With her he went to Avalon, so the Bretons tell us, to a very beautiful island, where there the youth was carried off. No man heard of him again, and I have no more to tell. And he lived happily ever after till the end of his days. Right? What are we getting out of all of this? Okay. Sovereignty. Women's voices. A reversal of the traditional romance story. A particular kind of Arthur, the way that he is presented in his court. And this debate over popular fame and authority derived from popularity versus happiness derived from personal, private pleasure. In a sense, Lanval's posed with the same problem that the knight was posed with in the Wife of Bath's tale. And he screws up, but he knows he's screwed up, and he leaves it to the woman to solve the problem, which she does. This poem asks us, what's more important? That everybody knows your name or that you're happy? If you think back to the things that we've been reading in this class, this is not the first person to ask that question. I mean, we have heard other people. Think about Achilles' choice, right? This was Achilles' choice. Do you want to be famous and die young? Or do you want to be a nobody but live a long life? Public reputation versus private happiness, right? This is the same question, the same thing that Hrothgar talks about to Beowulf when he says, look, you're not going to live forever. You're not going to be strong and healthy forever. And Hrothgar sides with public reputation, that it's all about, keeping everybody happy all the time. And right now, when you're young, you get fame easy. But when you're old, you're not going to get fame easy, and you're going to have to work for it. When Dante, the pilgrim, and Virgil wander through hell, it seems like they can't bump into anybody in hell without somebody saying, when you get back to earth, I want you to tell my story. Why? Why does everybody want their story told? Well, because they can't get private happiness. All they can get is the other thing, the public acclaim. And if you look through each of these stories that we read, it's almost always the same answer in terms of which one of these two things is better to have. Now, often the stories end with a kind of happy ending where your protagonist gets both. They get both public reputation, fame, and private happiness. But they only get that because they've learned that it's private happiness that matters. And the public fame isn't worth it. And they learn that, and they they learn it the hard way, and then because of the story has a happy ending, they end up getting both. Lanval vanishes. He goes off with the Lady of the Lake into Avalon, and he never comes back. And he never enjoys that fame, unless you count the fact that his story is told forever. That now it's 600 years later and we're still reading it. People that tell me that literature isn't relevant to us today, that these stories are just too old, they're not about anything anymore, and we don't, that these people are, I don't think they're reading the same books I'm reading. I mean, our society is still talking about these same issues. What is the price of fame? Is it better to be famous or to be happy? And to what extent are those two things self-exclusive? In these stories, the women figure it out. It's the women that make you happy, or the women that make you famous, and the best way to get ahead is to let them decide what they're going to do for you. Okay, let's pause there. We'll come back and we'll do Sir Gawaine. All right, we're back, and we're here to talk about Sir Gawaine and the Green Knight. In a previous lecture, when we were talking about Chaucer, we talked about how there were two different sort of strands of literature in England at about the same time, and they were basically parallel. One of those strands was the Chaucer poetry, the Chaucer literature. Essentially, we're talking about the literature of the city, specifically of London. The rival strand of literature, the rival tradition at the same time, was more to the middle of England, near Wales. If you think of England, Wales is the west coast. Right? It's separated from the rest of England by mountains, which created a section of Wales there on the west coast of England, which had its own culture and was able to be fairly isolated from the rest of England in terms of its language and its traditions. And this is where the Welsh language, for example, was spoken. Well, this second tradition of writing in England was known as the Midlands dialect, because it was in the middle of England, near Wales. And the greatest writer of this tradition is anonymous. We don't know anything about him or her. We call him the Gawaine poet or the Pearl poet, after the two of the texts that we have from this person who, which have been most influential and are most read. There's only one copy of each of them. We talked back when we were talking about Beowulf. Remember the whole story about the Cotton Library, that library where all the books in England were kept on bookshelves, each of which had a Roman emperor on top of each bookcase? Well, just as the only copy of Beowulf exists in one of these books in the Cotton Library, so the only copy of Sir Gawaine and the Green Knight and the Pearl and a couple of other poems, one called Cleanness and one called Patience. The only copies of these poems exist all together in a single book in the Cotton Library under Nero's head, right, the head of Roman Emperor Nero, which means that this book also was almost burned in the fire, the same fire that ran through the Cotton Library and almost destroyed Beowulf, although there's no smoke, no burning stains on this book. We didn't read this book for centuries. It was rediscovered in the late 1800s, and it doesn't seem to have been terribly influential in terms of writers who came after it, because, as we talked about last week in the Chaucer lecture, Chaucer won that contest, that rivalry, and the Midlands dialect and the whole tradition of kind of Middle English literature sort of died out. But if you look at it, we're reading it in translation. We're reading it in a modern English translation instead of the medieval version. But if you were looking at it, you would recognize it as having some roots with Beowulf, because like Beowulf, which again was a literature that we didn't read for hundreds of years, it's alliterative. And that alliteration is preserved very heavily in our edition here in this book. But the themes and the plots of the story have evolved a lot since Beowulf. If you ever get a chance, you should read Pearl. It's a beautiful poem. It's about a guy whose daughter, his young child daughter, has just died. And he's trying to come to grips with his grief and with her. And it's a very Christian poem. All of this literature is very Christian. We think that maybe the Gawaine poet might have been trained in a religious school. We don't really know. But he seems pretty comfortable with religious texts. But at least in Sir Gawaine, what we also see, in addition to this religious text, is a very, very deep source of knowledge in terms of the court, fashion, the cuisine of the royal court. We have a lot of focus on the physical details of living at court. And he will go on for whole paragraphs about a feast or about a person's dress or about the armor that somebody's wearing. And he'll just lavish on the elaborate, very expensive richness of the clothes, for example. Or when you read the basic outline of Sir Gawaine and the Green Knight is pretty straightforward. Gawaine is a knight in the court of King Arthur. And for those of you that don't remember who Gawaine is, he doesn't make it into the movies most of the time. But Gawaine is Arthur's nephew. He is the son, the eldest son, of Arthur's eldest sister. And what that means is that because Arthur himself has no children, Gawaine is his heir. Gawaine is the person who will inherit the kingdom because he has the strongest claim to the throne. He is the oldest son of Arthur's oldest sister. But in this poem, he portrays himself very humbly. Well, anyway, Gawaine is at the court of King Arthur when suddenly, on Christmas Day, they're sitting down to a big feast, and Arthur has this rule in his court that he will not sit down at the table until he's heard a story of some great adventure, or some actual adventure occurs. So everyone else is sitting down, but Arthur's waiting for someone to fulfill this because he can't sit down at the table until he's gotten his adventure. And into the court bashes this magical man. He's green. He is entirely green. He's not in armor. He's in like expensive, rich, upper class clothing. It's entirely green. But not only that, his horse is green, including the mane. Everything is green. And the man himself, his hair is green, and even his skin is green. He's got this immense, big, bushy beard, and he has an axe, a big axe. And he offers a deal. He offers a game. And this is a trope in English literature called the beheading game. The beheading game goes like this. The Green Knight offers, well, here's the deal. I will give any one of you a free swing at my head. And the Green Knight, by the way, is huge. He's like half giant or something. He's so big. I'll give you a free swing at my head. But after you do that, whatever happens, I get a free swing back. Okay, now these knights are pretty strong. They can chop off a guy's head, and even if they can't, there's no way you're going to live. If they swing an axe at your head, you're dead. But the impossibility of the beheading game is what makes it clear that there's something magical going on, right? No one would offer this if the game wasn't rigged. But on the surface, it looks like it's easy, right? What's the matter? Are you too afraid to take a swing at an unarmed guy, right? So it becomes a challenge to your honor and your courage. Are you brave enough to accept whatever the trick is in the game? There's a trope in some of our literature that we've read, and I call it the ultimate vow. When you meet somebody like a king who says, "I'll give you anything you want if you do this thing for me." And then the character does that thing, and then the king is forced to come through on his ultimate vow. "I'll give you anything you want." And the person says, "Well, I want X." And now the king has to do it. And we saw this in Lanval, for example. And we see it in Gawaine and the Green Knight, where Arthur makes the ultimate vow. Or, in a sense, the Green Knight and Gawaine get wrapped up in a kind of ultimate vow, right? Gawaine is asked, "Well, Gawaine is asked, are you willing to do anything? Are you willing to? You don't know how I've rigged this game. You don't know what it is that I can do. So are you going to take the challenge or not? Are you going to take the dare or not?" And Gawaine says, "Well, first, Arthur. No one will do it." So Arthur gets up and says, "Well, okay, I'll do it." But then Gawaine says, No, that's not right. You shouldn't have to do it. That's what knights are for. I'll do it." And he sort of insists on the challenge because of his relationship to Arthur. He says, "Look, I'm your nephew, but I've never done anything to prove that I'm worthy of being a knight. I just got it because I inherited it. I'm just a figurehead at this point. So I need to prove that I'm a knight." And this is a pretty enlightened attitude, if you think about it. It's pretty modest and humble for a character like Gawaine. To say, "Well, have I done anything to prove that I'm worthy of being a knight? So that's why I get this challenge." And Arthur says, "Okay, fine, you can do it." So Gawaine takes the axe, and the Green Knight bends over, and he bares his neck, and there's like green skin there. And Gawaine gets the axe, and he chops the head right off. And somebody even kicks it as it falls off the body. And blood shoots everywhere. But the Green Knight doesn't die. He's magical. And the body walks over and picks up the head, and he holds the head up by the hair. And then the head talks and says, "Boy, I got you. I'm going to give you a year and a day. And the day after Christmas, next year, you have to meet me at the Green Chapel, which is where I live. And on that day, I get my free swing at your head. Or everyone's going to call you a coward. Your reputation will be ruined." A lot of people in this situation say, "Well, just don't show up." Right? But the story isn't about that. The story is about public reputation, just like Lanval was and so many other things that we've read about in this class. Gawaine's public fame will be ruined if he doesn't show up. Well, Gawaine spends most of the rest of the year partying with Arthur. He's in denial till November. And then finally, November 1st rolls around and he says, "Okay, well, I guess I better go looking for the Green Chapel because I don't know where it is." And everyone figures he's dead, right? There's no way that Gawaine can survive having his head chopped off. So they all sort of bid a teary-eyed farewell, and off he goes. And he travels the country, and he has a lot of adventures, which our poem does not go into. The poet just says, well, he fights all these monsters, and he goes to all these crazy places, but he doesn't find the chapel until finally, just a couple of days, like a week before Christmas. He prays to God, and and lo and behold, he finds this castle. It's fabulously wealthy, best castle anyone's ever seen. And he goes in there and he meets the man who runs the castle, who for most of the poem is unnamed. He does get a name at the end. His name is Bertilac. And Bertilac has two women in the house. His wife, who's younger than he is, about Gawaine's age, and beautiful and sexy. And an older woman who's described in very unflattering terms as being not only old but fat. who is never named, but who might be Morgan Le Fay, the great magical enchantress, who we'll get to later on at the end of the poem. And Bertilac hosts Gawaine, says, oh, what a stroke of luck that King Arthur's nephew, Sir Gawaine, the famous knight, should be here in my court over Christmas. Well, you've got to stay. And Gawaine says, well, I can't. First he stays for a couple of days, doesn't say anything, stays for a couple of days. He's only got, a few days left, but, Gawaine's kind of swept up by the social courtliness. We'll get to talking about Gawaine in a minute. I'm just sort of skimming through the plot right here. He stays a couple of days, but then he says, look, I can't stay. I gotta go. I gotta find this Green Chapel. And Bertilac tells him, oh, why didn't you say so? Look, the Green Chapel's like 2 miles from here. Stay a few more days, and then I'll lead you down to the chapel the morning that you have to. I'll send the servant, actually, and we'll get you to the chapel on time. And Gawaine's like, thank God, somebody knows where it is. Great, can't wait to stay. Not only does Gawaine want to stay because Bertilac's treating him like royalty, but also because Bertilac's wife is very beautiful, and they get along, she and Gawaine get along really well. They talk all the time. They're always spending their time in each other's company. Gawaine really likes to be with her, and so he says, oh, sure, I'll totally stay. Okay. Bertilac makes a deal with Gawaine. He says, okay, here's the deal. We're gonna play a little game. Every day, I'm going to go out hunting, because I love to hunt. And when I come back at the end of the day, I'll give you whatever I got hunting. In exchange, you have to give me whatever you get during the day while you stay here at the castle. Once again, sounds like a sucker bet, right? Sure, Gawaine says, I'll do that. Well, so during the 3 days, Bertilac goes out hunting. The first day, he hunts a deer. And not just one deer, but they get they bring back a fantastic feast. And Bertilac says, well, here's everything that I got. Well, what has Gawaine been doing that day? Gawaine is in bed the next morning while Bertilac goes off hunting, when Bertilac's wife sneaks into the room. And she gives Gawaine the eye, and Gawaine is awake. He knows that she's there, but he doesn't know what to do. Think back to Lanval's situation with the queen. Gawaine doesn't know what to do. He's paralyzed. So he pretends to be asleep. Like, oh, maybe she'll go away. But she doesn't go away. She sits down next to him. He's like, oh, okay, I guess I better talk to her. So he pretends to wake up, stretches, right? Oh, what are you doing here? Right? He fakes surprise. And she's like, oh, you're not a very good knight. If anybody can just sneak into your bedroom like this, I'm kind of surprised. And then she and Gawaine get into this kind of verbal battle. This is the arena where Gawaine's skills are tested. Not on the battlefield. This is not really, although it's a story about, a guy who's beheading somebody else, it's not really a story about physical prowess. It's a story about Gawaine's ability to fight in the bedroom. Specifically, to ward off attacks from a woman who's trying to seduce him. And he doesn't want to sleep with her because, although she's beautiful and he gets along with her and she's great, she's married, and that would be bad, right? That would be dishonorable, it would be immoral to do. And we have a lot of dialogue between the wife and Gawaine as she and he have this sort of logic debate over whether or not they should be closer, whether or not they should kiss, or whether or not they should be lovers. And she presents an argument, and he counters the argument, and then she presents another one, and he counters that. And it becomes this kind of rhetorical debate. In other words, when somebody's trying to make a pass at you, how do you let them down easy when, if you screw up, they can really make your life miserable? This is the same situation Lanval was in, and it's the situation Gawaine is in right now. So the end of the first day comes, and he managed to keep her from sleeping with him, but she insists on a kiss. She sort of guilts him into it. She's like, oh, wow, geez, you couldn't possibly be Gawaine. He's like, what are you talking about? Of course I'm Gawaine. She says, no, because Gawaine would never let a beautiful young lady walk out of the room without at least getting a kiss. He's like, fine, okay, come here. Right? And so they kiss, and then she leaves. Bertilac returns with the deer and all the venison that you could ever want to eat. And it's time to pay up. And Bertilac says, all of this that I've hunted today, I give to you. And Gawaine says, and I give this to you. And he grabs Bertilac in a great big hug and gives him a big smooch on the lips. Mwah. And Bertilac laughs and he says, oh, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. You're getting a lot for not having done much work. You win. You're winning this game. Let's do it again tomorrow. Gawaine says, you're on. Okay, so then this is repeated the second day. And the second day, Bertilac hunts a boar, which in medieval era was an extraordinarily dangerous beast, and many people were killed hunting boar. You had to invent special weapons to hunt the boar, because if you stabbed a boar with a spear, arrows were no good, because the boar's hide was so thick, and had so much fat on the outside of its body, that an arrow just didn't get to anything vital. So you could fill the thing with arrows and it wouldn't die. You had to spear it. But what happened is when you stabbed the boar with a spear, the boar would just run up the spear and kill you with its enormous tusks. Well, so they invented special weapons to stop the spear, including, it was called a boar spear, and it had this big crossbar down near the blade. So the boar would run onto this, you'd stab this boar with a spear, and he would try to run up the blade, but he'd hit the crossbar, and he'd stop, and then you just hold him there, right, while everybody else stabs him. Well, anyway, hunting the boars were very, very dangerous. So the first battle with the deer was primarily one of speed, of elusiveness, quickness. They make a point of noting that the Bertilac didn't allow the hunting of stags, of male deer, only the female. The second day is primarily a contest of strength. And Bertilac, again, lots of poetry is spent on the fabulousness of the hunt and the kill, and the boar is dressed out and butchered. And we have poetry about butchering the boar. A lot of it. The level of detail that's spent on elements of this poetry makes us ask, why is it there? Why is all this detail there? Does it have to do with the audience? Is it because that's what the audience expected? Or because that's what the audience knew about? Is it a metaphor? Is it, what all is going on here? So then Bertilac returns, and he reveals all the boar meat, and Gawaine says, oh, now what's Gawaine been doing? Okay, so once again, the wife comes into Gawaine's bedroom when her husband is gone, and they again have this debate over whether or not they should be lovers. And this time, she opens up by saying, you could just take me by force. You have the physical power, right? It's a contest of strength. You have the physical power to just take whatever you want. So why don't you? And they debate again and again, and Gawaine is still in that same situation where, how do I please her? And they actually kiss a couple of times. They kiss once when she first comes into the room, and then again when she leaves. With Gawaine having won again, having again triumphed in this duel of social power. I've kept her from sleeping with me and let her down easy. Gawaine could just get out of this the easy way, right? But that was Lanval's route, right? Lanval lost his temper and he spoke rashly and he insulted her, and she went back to her husband, in that case the king, and got Lanval in trouble. This is Gawaine's situation. He can't just tell her no. He has to let her down easy. Because if she gets mad, then she goes to her husband, and who is he going to believe? He's going to believe his wife. And Gawaine will be the person whose reputation is ruined, right? So he can't just say no. He's got to convince her no. And he does. So when Bertilac gives him all of the boar, Gawaine grabs him and gives him 2 big kisses. Now, if this business about the kissing is striking you a little weird, it continues to strike people a little weird for hundreds of years after this book was written. There's other elements, other literature that we've read has had these sort of homoerotic moments in them. We talked about the Pardoner's Tale, for example, and how the Pardoner specifically was called out as gay by the narrator, by Chaucer. And we have this moment at the end of the Pardoner's Tale where we kind of have a homophobic moment where Harry Bailey specifically threatens the Pardoner's sexuality. He says, "I'd rather have your balls in my hand than I'll cut them off and make a holy relic out of them by burying them in turd." Harry Bailey doesn't say that to everybody. He only says it to the gay guy. It's when the Pardoner is offering his wares, Harry Bailey reacts as if the Pardoner made a pass at him. And he reacts with this kind of violent reaction. But how is that resolved? It's resolved by the knight saying, "Okay, everybody, just kiss and make up." And the knight makes Harry Bailey and the Pardoner kiss. In the same way, Gawaine, kisses Bertilac, and there's this sort of, homoerotic moment. And Bertilac, but they laugh about it. They don't, they just make a joke out of it. It seems pretty natural, and that violent reaction that we saw by Bailey, for example, is not here amongst the upper class. Well, the third time's the charm, right? The third throw is the hardest, as they say in this poem. It's that we've had this saying in English for 1,000 years. On the third day, Bertilac goes out, and he doesn't find a boar or a deer, any one of those noble beasts. He finds a fox, and they hunt the fox. And the fox is a tricky foe. They call him Renard, which is a reference to a medieval folk tale about Renard the fox, who was kind of a character in medieval literature. He's this fox who thinks and talks. He's a magical fox. And he outwits and tricks people in these sort of Aesop fable, kind of story fable, children's stories kind of way. The fox is not a worthy animal, and after he catches the fox, and he does catch it and kill it, and he brings it back to Gawaine, he says, all I found was this lousy fox. Well, meanwhile, Gawaine's fighting with a different kind of fox, right? He's fighting Bertilac's wife, the third day in the bedroom. And he makes it through the day, putting her off again. They kiss again. He puts her off until she's leaving. Well, she says, "Look, why don't you give me a token? Okay, you're not going to kiss me. You're not going to be my lover. But why don't you give me something that I can keep as a memento of your visit?" And Gawaine's like, he's thinking to himself, no way. Because if I give her something, then she could show it to her husband. There's a million ways this could go wrong. So he says, no. He says, I don't have anything. And if and whatever I gave you would be too humble for you. Can't we just be friends? And she says, okay, well, you're not going to give me something, so I'm going to give you something. And he says, no, don't give me anything, because he doesn't want to lead her on, right? He's trying to take the moral high road the whole time. Finally, she says, look, you're afraid to take anything from me because you're worried that it'll be too rich, and then you'll be morally obligated to give me something back in return. So instead, I'll give you something very humble, something that's not worth a lot of money. I'll give you my belt. And she has this belt. The phrase at first is calls it a girdle, but it's just a belt. And it's green. And she takes it off, and she says, here, I'll give you this. And he says, I can't take it. She She says, oh, well, that's too bad, because this girdle could save your life. Now, Gawaine has been having a fine time in Bertilac's house, but he has not forgotten that he is scheduled for death. He says, save my life? She says, oh, yeah, this belt is magical, it's enchanted, and no one who's wearing it can be killed. But since you don't want it, he says, no, okay, I'll take it. And he takes it, and she's very happy. She says, now whatever you do, don't tell my husband. Don't let him find out you got this from me, right? Because we'll both be in trouble. He says, okay. Gawaine has failed his moral test. He has taken a gift from the lover. Okay. But he still has time to make it good. They get together at the end of the day. Bertilac says, oh, I just got this lousy fox. It's not much. But here, it's all yours. What did you get? And Gawaine grabs him and kisses him 3 times. He says, that's it. That's all I got. He doesn't say anything about the belt. He doesn't give the belt over, right? Well, they feast. Bertilac says, okay, the Green Chapel's just 2 miles out. I'm going to give you a servant. He can lead you there. Thank you for staying in my house over Christmas. Yay. Next day comes. Gawaine rides off with a servant, and then the servant leaves him, and he finds what we have been told is, quote, the Green Chapel. The Green Chapel is not an actual chapel, it's a cave. It's like a haunted cave. It should remind us of, the watery den of Grendel's mother, or one of those other haunted story kind of places. It's a outside, beyond the normal civilization kind of wilderness magical spot. And Gawaine finds the Green Chapel and makes his way in there, and he can hear something, and he finds out what it is. He realizes what it is. It's the grinding of an axe. He can hear the Green Knight sharpening the axe that's going to chop his neck off. Well, he finds him, and there he is, decked out all in green, just like before. And the Green Knight says, all right, bend over. and Gawaine bends over, and he's got the belt on underneath his clothes. And the Green Knight winds up, and he comes down with a first stroke, and Gawaine flinches. He shrinks from the axe, right? Perfectly normal reaction. Anybody would do it. And the Green Knight stops and kind of heckles him a little bit and laughs at him. And Gawaine says, okay. I'm ready now. I'm ready. Do it. So then the next swing comes, the second swing comes, and the Green Knight stops early before hitting him. And Gawaine hasn't flinched. And the Green Knight says, okay, right now you're ready. Here comes the third one. And the third swing comes, but instead of chopping off Gawaine's head, the Green Knight only nicks him in the neck, just enough to make it bleed, just enough to make a scar. And then Gawaine jumps up, runs back, grabs his armor, pulls out his weapons, and says, okay, all right, you want to swing at me again, you're going to get some. And Bertilac laughs and says, look, the Green Knight, I should say, because now the Green Knight says, look, let me tell you what's really been going on this whole time. I am Bertilac. I am the guy who's been hosting you at my house. You can't recognize me because I'm green. But I set my wife onto you. It's all been a test. And I know about the belt and everything. And I know that you hit it and you failed, right? The first 2 swings are because I missed you. The first 2 swings I swung and I didn't cut you because on the first 2 days, you kept your promise. You gave me everything that you got. And more importantly, you didn't sleep with my wife, right? But the third day, you kept something. And you broke your vow. And so I cut you. But, he says, you had a really good reason for lying. You valued your life. You didn't want to die. That's the only reason why you lied to me. You didn't want to die. And that's very understandable. So I only cut you a little bit. I didn't chop off your head because, you did what your flaw, your fault is understandable. Anybody would have done it. Gawaine is crushed by this. He's completely depressed. He's failed, and everybody knows he's failed. His failure is now public shame. And Berglet's like, don't worry about it. It was all a game, Morgan Le Fay made me magical. She made me green and made it so my head could come off and I wouldn't die. It was originally a test for Guinevere. Morgan was actually doing this so that a crazy thing would happen in front of Guinevere, and she was hoping to freak Guinevere out and scare her and maybe, make her pass out or something. She just wanted to scare Guinevere. And that's why I came into the court that day. It's nothing against you. It's nothing personal. Come back to my house. You can party at my house. My wife likes you. You can, we can hang out together. And Gawaine says, no, I think I'll be going. And he takes the belt, and he goes back to Arthur's court, and he tells the story, and he's wearing the belt now, out in public, not underneath his clothes, but in public. He wears it over his chest like a sash. So it starts up on the right arm, the right shoulder, and it goes down so it buckles underneath his left arm. And he wears this belt over his chest. Not as a mark of his victory, not a trophy like, Grendel's arm or something, but as a badge of his failure. And he tells Arthur and everybody the whole story, and they're like, oh, that's so bad. How can we help? I know. Let's make everybody wear sashes like this in your honor. And Arthur has everybody in the court wear these green sashes across their chest. And it becomes the fashionable thing, and everybody's wearing them. And you got to feel sorry for poor Gawaine, because that's like exactly the opposite of what he wanted. Because he says, I'm going to wear this sash so that whenever I start to get too uppity, and I start to get too proud, and I start to get too high and mighty on myself, I'm going to remember my screw-up. And now everyone in the court is wearing the symbol of Gawaine's screw-up. But they don't get it. This is an important realization at the end of the play, end of the poem. Arthur and his court are so obsessed with fashion, with entertainment, with games. Knighthood has become a play to them, a game. It's all just court fashion. And they've forgotten what it really means. The lesson, the morality, the ethics of what is right and what is wrong. Gawaine has been reminded of that. And that's why he wears the belt, the garter is what it's called later, as a symbol to remind him of his failure, to make him a better man. But it's just turned into the latest fashion by Arthur and his men. And that's how the story ends. Now, we sort of walked through the whole thing, plot-wise. What else should we be getting out of that? Well, once again, we should be asking ourselves, what is the portrayal of Arthur in this story? How does it compare to Lanval or The Wife of Bath's Tale? What about the Queen? This idea that Morgan Le Fay, her problem is not with Arthur but with the Queen, is a really old one. The original myth suggests that Morgan fell in love with Guinevere's cousin. And Guinevere didn't approve of that relationship, and so she broke it off. She forced the cousin to renounce Morgan. And so Morgan's been jealous and angry over that ever since, especially because Guinevere went on to have an affair with Lancelot. And so Morgan saw this as all very hypocritical, and so she doesn't target Arthur, who's her half-brother. She instead targets Guinevere, because Guinevere ruined her love life and is a complete hypocrite. But Arthur is not portrayed in a very flattering way in this story. He's portrayed as a guy who has lost touch with what knighthood is really about. What else? We see more of this debate over public fame and private happiness. Gawaine, as a character, has had a lot of different versions in literature, and depending on which film you've seen or which book you've read or what comic strip you've read, Gawaine can be portrayed as anything from a really, really good guy to a complete jerk who's got no redeeming qualities. In Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur, the sort of traditional version of King Arthur, Gawaine is portrayed very poorly. It's always other knights who do the right thing and Gawaine who always does the wrong thing. But what we're seeing in Gawaine and the Green Knight is Gawaine as the archetypal British knight, the greatest of all British knights. Keep in mind that Arthurian literature is very broad, and it brings in characters from all over. So Lancelot is French, and you have characters like Tristan, who's from Cornwall, who's Cornish. You have Welsh characters, Scottish characters, and so on. We have this idea that Arthurian literature is all they're all basically the same, they're all basically English, but the idea of Englishness or Britishness was actually very cosmopolitan at the time. People thought of Britain as being a group of different countries that were all united together. So Britain was not just Britain, it was Wales and Scotland and Cornwall and Brittany and so on, and Ireland. And all of these different countries were all brought together. So Arthur's table is actually a very international and a kind of egalitarian and cosmopolitan symbol to the people that were reading it at the time. Well, Gawaine is the representation of the best of the English knights. He's not only a great warrior, but he's also courtly. He wins those conflicts with Bertilac's wife. He's infamous as a servant of women who will do what women want, but he's also a lover. His reputation as a lover, as a ladies' man, is well known and established. In a lot of the literature, Gawaine he's almost never without a duchess. There's always some woman, and she's always beautiful and wealthy, that happens to be his lover of the moment. So he's a ladies' man, but he's also a warrior, and he's a virtuous knight. He's honorable and noble in the sense of his morality, his ethics are good. At the very beginning of Gawaine and the Green Knight, you run into Troy, mentions of Troy and Aeneas and so on. We talked about this in a previous class, this idea that every culture wanted to trace their roots back to Troy. For a while, there was actually a movement to rename London as New Troy or Troyvantium in an attempt to capitalize on this idea that Britain was named Britain because it was founded by Brutan, who was the great-grandson of Aeneas. Brutus was Aeneas' great-grandson, and he founded the nation of Brutan, which we now call Britain. And so that goes all the way back through. You can see the footprints of Aeneas and Virgil in so much of what we read this semester. Look at the role of Guinevere in all of these things that we've read. In Lanval as the seductress, in Wife of Bath's Tale as the power in the courtroom, and in Gawaine and the Green Knight as the object of the plot. There's a lot of emphasis on fashion and courtliness in this poem, which suggests that those were things that the audience were appreciating, that this was a poem that was told for a courtly audience. Maybe not an urban audience, but rather a court of the country. What else have we run through in our hurried discussion of the plot. I'm looking at the bottom of 734. This is when Gawaine is insisting that Arthur give him the chance to play the beheading game. I am weakest of your warriors and feeblest of wit. Loss of my life would be least lamented. Were I not your nephew, my life would mean nothing. To be born of your blood is my body's only claim. This is Gawaine's modesty, his humility, and this idea that he's acknowledging what the wife of Bath also acknowledges in her tale, that nobility does not come from blood. You are not born good. You have to prove your value. There's moments of real horror in this poem. The cleanness of the strike cleaved the spinal cord and parted the fat and the flesh so far that the bright steel blade took a bite from the floor. The handsome head tumbles onto the earth, and the king's men kick it as it clatters past. Blood gutters brightly against his green gown, yet the man doesn't shudder, or stagger, or sink, but trudges towards them on those tree-trunk legs, and rummages around, reaches at their feet, and cops hold of his head, and hoists it high, and strides to his steed, snatches the bridle, steps into the stirrup and swings into the saddle, still gripping his head by a handful of hair. It's like a scene out of Walking Dead or something, right? It's pretty cool. We should understand the difference between Gawaine, the conscientious knight, and the court of Arthur, which is mostly concerned only with partying, and you see this throughout the poem in many, many places, including the time when Gawaine wastes most of the year frittering away at the party rather than going out and doing his quest. I want to address this question of the Green Knight himself. There's been, today, when we talk about a Green Knight, even the word green has all kinds of connotations that aren't in the original poem. If you go and you watch films or read books or things in which the character of the Green Knight appears, he's often portrayed as a kind of nature figure, a kind of embodiment of nature. And this poem becomes an environmental poem, a poem about how we have to preserve and respect the environment. It becomes a poem about environmentalism. And the Green Knight is literally green. He recycles. Okay, that's not in the poem. There is a lot of nature in the poem, a lot of detail. But just there's a lot of detail about the fashion that people are wearing or the way that animals are killed and dressed out and hunted. But the knight himself is not an embodiment of nature, although he's portrayed that way in a lot of modern literature. And I'm not saying that you can't tell that story. You can retell the story of Gawaine and the Green Knight and make it about environmentalism and about how we have to respect the natural world and we have to save the planet and all that stuff. You can tell that story, but that's not this story. That's not the story as it's told. What we are getting is a test of Gawaine's character, his truthfulness, his ability to do what is right at the cost of his own life. And when Gawaine fails that test, and he accepts the belt, he thinks he's getting away with it and that nobody will know. But everybody finds out, and he's shamed forever. Gawaine loses in this poem, and I think that's what makes it so great. I want to talk about the second issue. Other than the first thing is this idea of the Green Knight as an environmental character, which he's not really in the poem. But secondly, I want to talk about the girdle, the belt itself. When you read the introductory material for this book, for this poem, they'll talk about the magic girdle that makes you invulnerable from harm, and that supposedly this is, an element of magic in the poem. Okay, the belt is fake. This is something that the writers of our introductory material and the many analysts who read this poem miss. The belt is fake. When Bertilac reveals his identity at the end, he says, "My wife made that belt." And Bertilac himself cuts Gawaine in the neck. the belt is a test. It doesn't really make Gawaine invulnerable. It's a red herring. It's a small fact-based correction, but it's worth noting, perhaps just so that we can all understand that that this literature is not universally agreed upon by critics and readers. And it's really easy for even sophisticated readers who have read this thing a million times, and I can't tell you how many times I've read this poem, for even sophisticated readers to make mistakes because we think we know what the story is about, and we don't go back to the text and look for the evidence. If there is one thing that I can teach you that will go beyond World Lit to the other classes that you're going to take and the rest of your college career and your career after that, it's go back to the text. Don't presume. Don't talk from your memory. Go back to the material and look at it again and find the evidence that supports you so that you're not going off of suppositions, assumptions, and presumptions. When you read the introductory material to this book and someone tells you that the girdle is magic and makes Gawaine invulnerable to harm, ask yourself, how could somebody make that mistake? And the answer is because they thought they knew it. They thought they knew the poem, and they didn't go back and question their assumptions. You will, as you are reading, come across yet another shield. Gawaine's shield has a 5-pointed star on it, and each of the 5 points of the star has a meaning, and each of the points has a particular virtue, and the whole thing is very allegorical. I'll let you walk through that section of the poem and think about how it might compare to the shields we've already seen. Well, we've been going on a long time, and we probably should wrap this up. That old woman that's with Bertilac is often thought to possibly be Morgan. Since Morgan is mentioned and the old woman never gets a name, that maybe that would explain why that old woman is there, if she's the one that's been manipulating this plot all along. Well, give it some thought, see what you think of the poem, give it a read. My advice is read it out loud. And if you ever get a chance, or you really want to read this poem, go find the Tolkien version, because Tolkien also translated it into modern English. And if you really want to get your nerd cred high, you've got to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, translated by J.R.R. Tolkien, who didn't just write about elves, dwarves, and dragons. Okay? All right, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.